A new poll by the Associated Press says racial prejudice in the US has increased since President Obama took office. The survey measured the reactions of a random group towards black Americans. 51% of those polled admitted to being prejudiced against black people. That's an increase from 2008. The poll also tested implicit attitudes, and in that, the number of people with anti-black prejudice jumped to 56%. They were asked questions without specifically being asked about racial attitudes. Now, according to AP, fewer Democrats admitted to being anti-black, at least 40% fewer than Republicans. But in the implicit test, that gap closed between Democrat, Republican and independent voters. Well, to give us some perspective on this poll, we're joined by James Braxton Peterson in Philadelphia. He's a political analyst and Director of African Studies at Lehigh University. Thanks very much for being with us. How surprised are you by this poll that America has become increasingly racist since getting a black president?
I'm actually not that surprised. I mean, there's been quite a bit of qualitative evidence to suggest that a lot of our discourse is still really racialized. There have been a number of different racial incidents in the public sphere, big cases such as the Troy Davis case, such as the Zimmerman murder trial for Trayvon Martin. There have been a lot of racial things going on over the course of the last 4 years that I think charge this discourse up. The study also looks at Hispanic attitudes towards Hispanic in the United States as well, and those numbers are pretty much comparable to those of black folk. And so you can look at all the sort of debates and discussions around immigration and look to that for the explanation for why some of these things are really charged up right now.
Do you think in some ways, I mean, it has been suggested this might be a backlash to be expected to perhaps progress that America made in electing Obama?
Yeah, well, you know, history tells us that the arc towards racial justice is complicated and more labyrinthine than it is a straight arc. And so, yes, sometimes there's progress and sometimes we take steps back. And to be sure, the election of President Obama is a moment of extraordinary pride for the African American community and for the community of color here in the United States. And some of that pride has been met with some of the backlash and some of the sort of racist attitudes that still exist here in America.
Just give us an idea of how racism manifests itself there in America. Do you find you face it?
Well, I shouldn't sort of use my own anecdotes as an example for how racism operates in America. We can look at the institutional numbers. We can look at what's happening in our public education system. We can look at how loans are distributed by the banks. We can look at how the police force interacts with African American communities. There are systematic examples of how institutional racism especially still operates here in the United States. I think the anecdotal stuff is important, though, as well. If you just look at this last week in presidential politics, you look at what Ann Coulter said, you look at what the shucking and jiving comment by Sarah Palin, you look at what John Sununu said in terms of his interpretation of Colin Powell's endorsement of President Barack Obama as being all about race. You look at Donald Trump, once again, asking for the president's papers. I mean, there are, in addition to all those institutional things that I previously listed, there are also anecdotal instances, particularly in the media and particularly in politics, that suggest that we haven't really moved beyond race and that we're actually in a little bit more of a racially charged atmosphere than we were even in 2008.
Okay, James Braxton Peterson in Philadelphia, thanks very much for joining us.